You ever have a really bad day and just wanna, really just... I know I have. In-game, of course. Well, good viewer, do I have something that could satisfy all that pent-up frustration? What? Hey, no! It's a power fantasy. I'm talking about a power... just forget it. In video games, there isn't a genre more akin to a power fantasy than the hack and slash. These games generally have you mowing down enemies left and right, or beating the ever-living crap out of just one. But what if that isn't enough? What if you were looking for something that could hack and slash a bit harder? Well, my concerningly ravenous viewer, look no further than Butcher's Creek, set in a quaint little town in the heart of Pennsylvania with just the nicest folk you'll ever meet.
Fuck you, son of a bitch, fucker!
You fucking goddamn fucker!
It's got everything you'll ever need. A nice one-bedroom apartment, a bloodied hammer, oh, and how could I forget, authentic snuff films. Now you might be thinking, this is a weird power fantasy. You know, I don't think this is for me. I'm just gonna, up. You can't just leave. After all, the Watcher is watching. If it wasn't obvious already, Butcher's Creek is where all the serial killers go to film their next victims. And upon hearing about it, you wanted in on those tapes. You sicko. I know this game seems very depraved and disgusting. There is no but, it absolutely is. However, this type of game isn't entirely unique, as it definitely takes inspiration from graphic horror games like Condemned and Manhunt, which, as many of you may know, was banned in several countries. I can't imagine why. Unlike Manhunt, Butcher's Creek has no executions, and instead focuses on decimating enemies in real time. However, when it comes to Butcher's Creek, there might be something else about it that piques your interest. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is who made it. Now, usually when I do this much build up for a developer, it can only be one man. And yeah, it's David Szymanski. I know I've already made 2 videos on his other games, but I always have to mention that this is the same guy who made Dusk and Iron Lung. So it basically combines a dark and grungy atmosphere with some boomer shooter elements. Seeing as Butcher's Creek is also a part of David's Night Fever series, I thought I'd give it a try and maybe see what connections I can make with his other games. Don't worry, I'll get into that later. But for now, let's get into the meat of Butcher's Creek. Like I mentioned before, your goal is to collect as many of those films as possible, which are all stored in VHS tapes. These are going to be important, as they act not only as the sole way to save your progress, but also to open locked doors and increase your health bar. But if you have a hard time finding those tapes, don't worry. You can also gain health by taking some nice photos for the Christmas album. Additionally, Polaroids of these brutal scenes can bring you back to full health. If you couldn't tell already, this game isn't exactly subtle with its dark humor. Speaking of dark, the game actually starts off by saying, oh yeah, by the way, the sun's kinda gone and exiles from hell are just roaming around. Good luck. But hey, we can still have fun. After all, this is a power fantasy. If your fantasy is to become a serial killer who kills other serial killers. After perusing around for a bit, you eventually get ambushed and are completely stripped down.
Good grief, he's naked!
Throughout the game, you'll find notes from the serial killers that reside there, some of which will make you glad you weren't stuck in that cage. Luckily, they do include useful information on where to find keys and also some juicy lore. In these notes, we learn that this is a cult, and the reason they constantly tape their murders is to appease the Watcher. Hey, I'm not kink shaming, but he needs a new hobby. Ironically, no one has actually seen the Watcher, and yet the tapes they leave in the offerings are always taken by the end of the day. So who is this Watcher? Is he a real person, or perhaps some sort of deity? That mystery is what makes an otherwise repetitive game keep some intrigue. However, before we dive deeper into the lore, let's talk about the brutal and honestly hilarious combat. What'd you say? Sorry. I know I mentioned those traditional hack and slash games and how satisfying those kills could be, but this one feels more like a survival horror game that just so happens to be violently entertaining. The best way I could describe it is like a rage room in video game form. As in Butcher's Creek, you can use pretty much anything in your immediate surroundings to brutalize everything in your way. Smack them upside the head with a rusty shovel, practice your axe throwing technique, oh my gosh, and even yeet trash bags across the room. No way I one-shot him with the garbage! But my favorite, and a David Szymanski specialty, pick up a bar of soap and watch them explode. Just don't drop it. Where you might find some difficulty is when your weapon breaks, and you have nothing else to defend yourself with. In that case, your only offense is to go back to 2010 YouTube and do a little I find it funny how as soon as they get anywhere near traps, they just instantly turn into ragdolls. Now, this mechanic would be incredibly broken if you didn't also have to worry about stamina. Personally, I despise stamina mechanics, for many reasons. Running costs stamina, swinging and missing costs stamina, even kicking things costs stamina. And yes, you can always parry to regain that stamina, but that's only if you can actually land it. Come on. Bro, but I understand why stamina in games exists. It's meant to add some realism and balance so you're not just breezing through the game without any challenge whatsoever. But I don't want realism, I want to keep hitting the funny swearing man.
Hey, fucker!
Yeah. Despite my grudges, the game is still pretty fun and satisfying to play, as a hack and slash should be. However, this is David Szymanski we're talking about, so it's only a matter of time until the game veers off in a different direction. Earlier, I mentioned the game's atmosphere, and while it is fairly dark, there's still this arcadey feel to it all. That is, until you enter the depths of where some of the more unhinged cultists live, the Magic Fairy Castle. Once you get past a whole bunch of enemies, the music starts to fade away, as you stare up at this tower in what seems like a pitch black void. No enemies, no objects, only stairs. With a game full of disturbing imagery and violence, this simple section was somehow more unnerving. Heading outside, things seemingly go back to normal. Like I said, normal. However, as we reach the tunnels, things get weird again. Before this point, you would encounter enemies that would take more and more hits to take down, sure, but now the enemies can somehow turn invisible. Like, this wasn't even established in any of the notes or anything, it just happens. What is established, however, is a prophecy. The Tooth Sower, a pickaxe-wielding harbinger of death, is supposed to unite with the Watcher in Crimson Communion to cause the apocalypse. Well, if he does show up, I'll bet we could take him with just about anything. You know, I feel like this is supposed to be a pretty important reveal, but the only thing on my mind was... After a quick pickaxe spree, you go down one final flight of stairs, and find the tape offerings for the Watcher, which this time, I collected instead. Walking further into his lair, the air gets thicker as the hallway feels endless. You can hear something coming closer, but you're not sure how far it really is. Until... Oh! Oh my gosh! My mic fell! If it wasn't obvious already, we were the Tooth Sower, who just brought forth the end of the world, with this being the last thing we see. This felt very similar to the ending of Iron Lung, with a monster jump scare being the inevitable end to all this tension. While the game on its own has some neat little lore, what we saw isn't the entire story. Fair warning, this is a bit of a lore dump, so I hope you're ready. Starting in the Magic Fairy Castle, we see serial killers with pony skeleton heads, which were worn as a sort of ritual to honor the ponies they had kept underground. But looking at another game in David's Night Fever series, The Pony Factory, you fight against those ponies, who turned out to be the result of human experimentation. The protagonist of that game was influenced by hell itself to steal this factory's energy source, which is actually the essence of sin. With that, he created a new factory, and formed a cult of devout followers, all to contain this abomination. Eerily, you can still hear the cries of the ponies in the depths, which further illustrates the cycle of misery. You got all that? Good, cause there's more. In Butcher's Creek, you're not only the prophesized Tooth Sower, you're also a descendant of the protagonist from Squirrel Stapler, the third game in the series. In this game, you're one of those exiles from hell who has been indulging in sinful activity. So much so that even God shows up to say, bro. Most of David's games lean heavily into spiritual and religious themes, so it only makes sense that his Night Fever series shows the consequences of messing with things beyond our understanding. It's also interesting to note that Squirrel Stapler and Pony Factory were originally made as a part of the Dread X Collection series, which houses a bunch of short indie games. So I feel like David maybe didn't have a ton of time to really polish them, which definitely shows. Hello? By no means is it required to play these games to get the most out of Butcher's Creek. In fact, I would argue not knowing anything about the lore makes the final stretch of the game more terrifying. However, it's still cool that David was able to make these completely different games connect into this bizarro world full of gore, violence, and depravity. And I, for one, can't wait to see what else his twisted mind comes up with next. Thanks for watching, and if you're still here, I appreciate you sticking around. It feels weird to say, but it doesn't feel like it's been 10 years since I made my first video on this channel, but here we are. So here's to 10 more. After all, this is only the beginning.